We are Star Wars versus Warhammer 40k Episode 5. This is when everybody says this picks up. I've been enjoying it just fine. So, let's see it get picked up. Here we go. There we go. I like it. Yes. A disaster in direct defiance of his Jedi General's orders. Current Captain Kraken has just rammed the outsider dreadnought, killing most inside. Disaster became catastrophe when the captain of the alien vessel detonated his warp engine, causing a massive explosion, wounding the Republic's forces and killing all the survivors on the outsider ship. It was into this grim scene that the rest of the outsider armada arrived, seeing no possibility for peace or understanding. Dr. Sheena strongly advocated against Renfi's plan of action and was removed from the bridge of the Honor Hound for her conduct. Now she sits confined to the laboratory with her colleagues, awaiting the consequences of the Jedi's actions. Let's go!
The ship quaked once more, resounding with a deep, thunderous thrum. Dr. Hackney was done asking nicely, done being tactful and careful. While the other two on the science team were too timid to speak up directly to a woman as formidable as Dr. Sheena, the ship was literally shaking. They were being confined to the laboratory. It was long past the time for temerity. "What in the galaxy is happening here? Sheena, what did you do?" the man half accused. Dr. Sheena hadn't spoken since arriving almost 5 minutes ago in the custody of 2 clone troopers. Dr. Hackney had known she had been conversing with the Jedi in charge of their expedition, but had been surprised to see her returned in custody. She didn't like Jedi. Everyone on the science crew knew that already. But what could she have possibly said to goad a man as tranquil as Renfi into doing this? She had spent the rest of the time after her return moping as if weathering some tragedy. The biggest tragedy, as far as the other 3 scientists were concerned, was that their lower-ranking staff members had been confined to their quarters suddenly and without explanation. Dr. Hackney's accusations seemed to finally snap her out of her torpor as her eyes raised and went wild. "Me? I didn't do anything but be the voice of reason. If you want to blame someone, blame the Sith-spawned Jedi for this
Okay, I gotta do it. Abandon reason! No only war!
travesty." "Well, we're going to blame you until you tell us what in the name of the many moons happened up there," Dr. Hackney retorted. At this, Dr. Sheena relented. The Syrian explained the events that had preceded to her being sent to the laboratory, doing her best to be brief without sparing any detail. "Well, clearly they are some kind of religious society, with this emperor of theirs at or near its head. Fascinating."
Oh god, it's a felonid.
"Always hammering religion into your anthropological studies, Tirani. The outsiders are obviously some kind of autocracy, most likely an empire if they have an emperor. Nothing innately religious about that,"
said Dr. Orthan, sneering all the while. "Oh, really? Because I'm pretty sure Dr. Sheena described a ship, and I quote, covered in skull iconography, and—" "Wait, skulls? What kind of skulls?" Dr. Hackney suddenly asked.
Yours soon.
Dr. Sheena felt a cold surge run through her from skull to spine at this. I can't be sure," she said, standing. "But they looked like human skulls, and the statues were of angels and men in armor. How did I not notice before?" she murmured.
"Notice what?"
asked Dr. Orthan. Dr. Tirani's face contorted in disbelief. "A coincidence. We need more data, she asserted. Dr. Orthan looked at her.
What? What's a coincidence?
He asked. It must be, Dr. Sheena said, moving now towards the main computer. Between the four of them, they had some of the greatest minds within the entire Republic. Mathematics, history, hyperon mechanics, quantum theory, xenoanthropology, and political science was just a small sampling of the subjects which each
Bro,
of
look
them
at his
were well
eyes.
versed in. Dr. Sheena's speciality was as a hyperon theorist, megahydronocatalyst technician, and political technological predictions analyst. She was also, less officially, a slicer, and it was this skill set she now deployed as she hacked
Now that's a hell of a resume.
into the Honor Hound's databanks, retrieving as many pictures and scans of the outsider craft as she could, as well as the translation matrix for their language. Another tremor ran through the ship as she sent the data to Dr. Tarani.
Well, one of you clue me in already.
Dr. Orthan whined. Hackneyan's eyes went wide, his hands dropping limply to his sides as he guessed upon what Sheena suspected. Don't even concern yourself with it, Dr. Hackneyan said. It's madness to even consider it.
Consider what?
This, Dr. Sheena said, turning on the holotable in the center of the laboratory and showing them a three-dimensional image of one of the larger outsider ships. It was massive, covered from bow to stern in enormous stacks of weapons, but that wasn't the reason she displayed it now. The ship was built with layers upon layers of buttresses, statues, pillars, iconography, and art which covered the whole vessel even more densely than the guns themselves. Golden, angelic depictions of humanoids in robes holding aloft swords stood or strode in frozen rendition as statues and mosaics. Twin-headed avians stretched their wings in stylized, shining art across the hull of the ship. And the skulls. So many skulls. Human skulls.
It's impressive, but what is this supposed to tell me?
Asked the doctor.
You're boned. That's what this is going to tell you.
Hackneyan wiped his face and scowled.
I did see a question earlier on another, it just popped up on my feed. They were asking if the ships that had arrived are the largest that the Imperium has. Not even close. There are ships called the Gloriana-class battleships, and they start at 20 kilometers. The biggest one is still in service, and it's the Invincible Reason, and it's at 28 kilometers. So just run a half marathon and you'll get a general idea.
Orthan, are you dense? Think for a moment. They came from beyond the edge of the galaxy. Their art is composed of human figures and human skulls. And if you had to describe that ship as something other than a ship, what words would you choose? Dr. Orthan shrugged.
Temple?
Try cathedral, said Dr. Tarani. Again, Dr. Orthan shrugged.
So what? They resemble humans, worship skulls, and fly around in cathedral ships. What is that? Oh no.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah!
Tarani said triumphantly.
By the splitting stars, are you seriously suggesting they've returned from deep space? The carking...
Dr. Orthan started, eyes going wide as saucers. The doors suddenly burst open then, and Dr. Orthan threw himself across the floor and under a desk. Standing at the entrance was Ren Fai and several clones, all armed. The Jedi had his lightsaber out, its golden blade burning the air, humming hungrily. "Come on, now!" he ordered, and with a little coaxing from the clones, the scientists began to follow as he led them out of the laboratory. There were 14 clones of assorted ranks here, the captain of the ship and a sergeant leading the way while Ren Fai brought up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. Between them all were the scientists, with Sheena at the front of that group. "What's happening?" Dr. Sheena asked as she jogged alongside the clone troopers. "We've been boarded. A retreat has been called. We are escorting you to the escape pods now," one of the clones said. The Syrian scientist felt desperate fear consume and replace the curiosity of her natural disposition. But at least the laboratory was not far from the escape pods. They reached the door access panel, and Sheena felt her heart leap into her throat when she saw it. Smashed. Someone had gotten here first, and had damaged the control panel to keep them from getting in. But she was relieved to find that it would not be enough, as one of the clones retrieved a code cylinder from his belt pack. The trooper walked to the door and fit the cylinder into a slot in the wall, forcing the door to open. As the Durasteel door slid back, a massive blue arm extended out from the now open room, seizing the clone and yanking him inside. The man screamed, but only for a few seconds before his voice was drowned out by the sound of blaster fire. The 13 other clones that were traveling with them had formed up on the opposite side of the door and began firing into the room.
This is when shit gets real.
Sheena stumbled away, falling onto her rear as she watched the clones empty their blaster packs into the escape pod access. Suddenly, there was a sound, like thunder, but shorter, deeper. It shook the doctor to her bones, and her hands snapped up to her head to cover her ears. But suddenly, she found herself bewildered as a warm, wet sensation washed over her. Her hands pulled away, coated in deep, arterial red. It was hot, extremely hot, and yet her hands, her arms, her whole body felt cold. She looked up, blinking droplets of color out of her eyes, watching. 5 bodies went flying, falling into pieces with just 2 shots of whatever that weapon had been.
You better run, squirrel.
The clone troopers it had struck turned into smears of brilliant color against the back walls of the hallway. They didn't even scream. They were just dead, gone before they'd realized it. Someone was screaming for them. Dr. Sheena looked back, expecting to see Dr. Tarani letting loose with all the force in her lungs. Such was the wailing she could hear. But it wasn't Tarani making the sound. That much was clear as Sheena's eyes found the other doctor's face. Skin paling, mouth pursed, eyes bulging. It was Dr. Sheena herself who was making the noise, the realization terrifying her even more than the gory spectacle she was being forced to witness. She clapped her hands over her own mouth, regretting the action instantly.
First contact with 40K. First contact with 40K face to face. Congratulations. Now you need therapy.
As the bitter, powerful taste of blood touched her lips. Renfai leapt across the corridor then, landing next to the door and seizing the code cylinder, which was still protruding from the wall. In the same instant, the large blue arm which had taken the first clone reached out and grabbed Renfai by the collar. The doctor had a better view of it this time. Enormous, metal, mechanized. But before it could pull the Jedi into the room, Renfai twisted the cylinder, slamming the door closed on the arm. At the same moment, Renfai swept the glowing yellow blade of his lightsaber up, cutting through the thick limb as easily as through the bulkhead of a ship. Another bark of thunder rang out through the crack in the doorway, and Renfai sidestepped the projectile, pulling the arm with him as he did and allowing the door to slam shut fully. The dismembered limb clung tenaciously to him, and almost pulled the Jedi down as it fell away from the door. It was heavy, and when Renfai seized it by the wrist and tore it off, it took most of his robe with it. He spun, pulling the code cylinder free from the wall and burning the input slot with the end of his lightsaber.
I had a question in my head of whether or not the lightsabers will be effective against the armor of the Space Marines. I'm guessing he came to the same conclusion that I did, which the Ceramite armor would not protect against a lightsaber.
We must hurry to the other side to reach the
get the hell
pods there. Now! The Jedi ordered. Some of them are in shock, General, said a clone.
This is like a horror movie.
Sheena. Was she in shock? Dr. Sheena wiggled her fingers and toes, feeling them as cold, clammy, barely coherent extensions of her body. Her heart was racing, and she was sweating despite how cold it was. It was so cold, despite the heat of the blood which coated her. Was that natural? No, you idiot. You're definitely in shock. She screamed into the sluggish void of her thoughts. With great effort, she slowed her breathing, reaching up to put a heavy hand on the clone kneeling over her, allowing him to help her rise to her feet. I'll be fine, she said, arms and legs trembling now, responding well enough.
Oh yeah.
Dr. Tarani had also gone into
Good
some
for her.
form of shock, but she was not recovering from it nearly as swiftly as Dr. Sheena seemed to be. Dr. Hackney was up, helping to steady Dr. Sheena.
Okay, if you're a Star Wars person, you don't know what basically just happened. They encountered a Space Marine who decided to stay in his room. And essentially a Space Marine, think about, I don't know, 800 pounds, 8 foot tall, pure muscle, genetically altered superhuman, who quite seriously is one of the most badass superhumans ever invented. And they're able to be mass produced as much as you can mass produce a Space Marine. But yeah, these things are pretty savage. They wield basically a hand cannon that fires rocket-propelled grenades that are armor-piercing. So there you go.
Sheena, his own hands clammy and covered in sweat, but his face, at least, seemed controlled, disciplined. His expression not one of fear, but of concern, not of helplessness, but of proactivity. That gave her a bit more strength as they were all rushed down the corridor towards the hangar. Numbly, she could barely feel her own footfalls as they left that stained place and the monster behind the door. But even as they moved away from the bloody gate which contained their enemy, Dr. Sheena suspected they were not fleeing towards safety. Her suspicions were confirmed when the group of clones and scientists reached the broken doorway which led into the hangar. There was fire and screaming. All the starfighters and bombers had long since been launched, leaving the hangar a mostly empty expanse of flickering lights and intermittent walls of shadow. On the far side of the expanse, the still broadly lit sections revealed troopers fighting viciously and dying in droves. They were fighting things, but what they were she could not discern. Morbid fascination seized her tightly as nearly a score of clone troopers, all standing in a brilliant line, seemed to transform, blossoming like time-lapsed roses, their upper bodies twisting into the air, white becoming fountains of cascading crimson.
Yeah.
And the thing doing it to them, it was large, like a Gundark, but thicker and much faster. Was it a droid? She had no time left to ponder, as Dr. Hackney pulled her along.
Oh, yeah,
The
that
battle
looks
was taking place
typical.
at the far side of the hangar, and in moments, Dr. Sheena realized why. A massive alien drill tube, obviously the device that had been used to board the ship, was protruding from the wall above them.
That's called a boarding torpedo, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A bunch of guys about that guy's size. A bunch of guys about that guy's size get into a torpedo that is fired, bores into a ship, and then offloads that. And, yeah, then you get to have fun with that. Yeah, go play with that. That's essentially how it works.
The fight had started here, and moved to where it was now. But it wasn't just the boarding vessel which made that obvious. It was the bodies. So many bodies. What the flickering light managed to illuminate was a scene straight out of a horror vid. Clones had been eviscerated, torn apart, physically crushed, and rent into halves. They lay in slick piles where they had fallen, some in firing positions, others in circles where they had attempted to surround something lethal. But Dr. Sheena's wide eyes had barely witnessed a quarter of the carnage.
Oh, man.
Troopers hung like grim banners from steel beams and rafters.
Oh.
They were in pieces. An arm here, a heavy, bloody helmet there, splayed out and left like gruesome parodies of the B-1 battle droids the clones themselves left dismembered in their wake. If that hallway outside of the escape pods had been the gates of hell, then the hangar was Gehenna proper. And then there was the smell. It forced its way through all of Dr. Sheena's mental defenses, cutting even through the torpor of her shock. It was thicker than the air, like a violating presence, stuffing itself into her nose, into her mouth. She could taste it. It was like rotten meat set next to a scented cinnamon candle,
Yeah.
but so much worse. Like feces and sugar mixed into a pot and set to simmer for days.
That's disgusting.
It was more than Dr. Sheena could handle, and she heaved for the second time that day,
Don't blame
as
you.
did Dr. Hackneyan and Dr. Tarani, spilling their most recent meals onto the gore-laden floor, while Sheena herself was left gasping.
Don't blame you.
They can't be human,
They
Dr.
are.
Hackneyan said, wiping his mouth. They just can't be. Dr. Tarani began to sob, falling to her knees and covering her eyes. Renfai went to her, but she seemed incensed, her limbs trembling as though she were caught in the throes of a seizure. Dr. Sheena tried to force her eyes forward, tried to not notice the slaughter around her. Instead, she noticed the captain of the clones, standing stiff as a statue, his eyes fixed on the battle being waged on the far side of the hangar. "Oh, Scrog," he cursed. "Come on, get her up, get them all moving," he ordered, going down to one knee and raising his blaster rifle. "One of those things just noticed us." Dr. Sheena rushed to where he was kneeling and came down beside the captain, following his aim to where the battle was taking place. Clones were dying quickly, and the lights at the far end of the hangar were completely shot out. She could see little more than the shadows cast by the flames and the muzzle flashes illuminating figures for microseconds at a time. Still, she squinted. She tried to see. Dr. Sheena guessed there were at least 30 clone troopers down there.
And from what I'm understanding from some of the comments that I've read, I was mistaken. These aren't Black Templars. This is normal Space Marine. This is Ultramarine Successor Chapter Space Marine. Which, this doesn't... I'm not really saying, I'm not really saying this to make light or anything like that, but, the Black Templars would have been a lot worse, because, yeah, there goes your innocence. You hear it? There goes your innocence. It's gone. It's bye-bye. It is bye-bye. But if it had been the Black Templars, it would have been a lot worse. And even with it being an Ultramarine Successor Chapter, which I believe it is, if they find that scientist with her appearance, she's gone automatically.
Taking cover in the flaming
Much less the
wreckage
Jedi.
of ATT they had brought up from the lower deck, presumably to help them fight the enemy off. They were firing, and despite the darkness, their shots certainly seemed to be tracking something. Not droids. Dr. Sheena was almost certain now. Too fast, too coordinated. "Get moving," the clone said, handing Dr. Sheena his blaster pistol, holster and all. Dr. Sheena nodded hesitantly, but took the weapon, managing to strap it around her waist despite her cold, trembling fingers. Just before she was made to move on, she thought she could make out a silhouette against the fires, but Dr. Hackneyan tugged her up and away before she could get a good look. They were both running, supporting each other's strides as the scientists did their best not to slip and fall. They flinched as they heard blaster fire start up behind them. The captain and several clone troopers had stayed behind to buy them time, and were engaging the enemy even then. Following the other clones, they crossed the bloody hangar and entered into an adjoining corridor. As they began to make their way down the well-lit, pristine hallway, Dr. Sheena looked back. Dr. Orthan was running after them, 2 clones just behind him, and the Jedi, Renfai, was just in front of Orthan, carrying the still weeping Dr. Tarani in his arms. His lightsaber was off, but still gripped in his right hand. She turned to look forward and noticed the 4 clones in front of them halting, forming up at the bend ahead, and creating a second defensive line. "Once we get around this corner, it's a straight shot to the room," Renfai yelled as he caught up to and then past Dr. Hackneyan and Dr. Sheena. "Keep running!" For once, Dr. Sheena obeyed his instructions with zeal, pumping her legs as hard and as fast as she could. As she ran around the bend, all 4 clones stationed there tossed their thermal detonators and turned away to take
Good
cover.
idea. Good idea.
She screamed. Dr. Orthan had still been behind them, but she couldn't hear her own voice as a thunderous explosion of air and heat gusted through the corridor and pushed her face down into the floor. Stunned, she lay there, sure her nose was broken, half sure she had been concussed. She would have remained there if not for Dr. Hackneyan's help, who had stopped to pull her up once more. They killed Orthan. They blew him up. They killed him.
Yeah,
she
they did.
babbled. Dr. Hackneyan was shaking his head, his lips moving.
Welcome to the Grimdark. Sometimes you don't have a choice.
His face animated and terrified. He was saying something, but she couldn't hear him, realizing that a ringing in her ears was drowning everything else out, leaving her in eerie, inappropriate silence. She looked away from Hackneyan, who was trying to pull her forward, her eyes darting back. She couldn't see the clones, not through the smoke, but she could see blue flashes in the murk, and something else. There was something there, but Dr. Hackneyan yanked her forward hard, getting her attention back in front of her, and almost throwing her with how hard he began to shove. Dr. Sheena felt a flush cover her face, recovering her wits and running at full sprint again, not needing to be pushed anymore as her scattered senses collected themselves. She could see it now, the door. Renfai had already opened it, and he was standing there, saber out and activated, Dr. Tarani cradled against him with his other hand. He was looking at something behind her. The instant Dr. Sheena reached him, he shoved Dr. Tarani into her arms roughly. "Take her! Get out of here!" the Jedi ordered. Dr. Sheena almost stumbled with the sudden weight of her colleague, and turned to hand her off to Hackneyan, but he wasn't beside her any longer. "Wait, where did—" she started, but Renfai cut her off as he shoved her into the room with a gesture of his hand. "Go!" he said. They were both
Run, he's
thrown by what
dying
felt
for you
almost
right
like a
now.
magnetic pull, and the doctor was sent sprawling onto the floor, Tarani falling right beside her an instant before the door slammed shut. The fall had been hard.
Okay, so I'm going to say something here before, because I got a feeling I know what's about to happen to this Jedi. But a lot of people make stupid claims when it comes to Space Marines versus, the like Jedi or Spartans or stuff like that. In reality, if this Jedi isn't capable of killing a Space Marine, I'm going to be kind of disappointed. I got a feeling it's going to take more than one Space Marine to kill a Jedi. But if it's a Space Marine librarian, that Jedi is done. It is a done deal. A librarian is able to use mental powers, and he'd be able to combat the Jedi on his own using 40K's brand of mysticism. The Space Marines would be as fast as the Jedi. I think the Jedi would be given the edge due to being able to use the Force. But that would be depending on the Jedi, of course. With the Space Marines, average Space Marine is going to kill a poor Jedi 1 versus 1. But your average Jedi will be able to do a good deal better for themselves. Here we go.
Had half-winded her, but Sheena forced herself up.
If it's a
She looked
librarian,
around.
he's screwed.
They were in the prep room right before the escape pods. The walls were lined with shelves of specialized emergency equipment and supplies to supplement the basic stores already in the pods. She ignored these, turning to Dr. Tarani and grabbing the weeping woman by her shoulders. "Come on, Tarani. Up now. We have to get going," Sheena said as she tried to pull her colleague to her feet. But Dr. Tarani was limp, uncooperative, inconsolable, and when Dr. Sheena heard the muffled sound of lightsaber strikes just outside the door, she gave her only one more hard tug before releasing the doctor and leaving her on the floor.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
The hallway was straight and narrow, terminating in an airlock door which led to the rows of escape pods. She got up unsteadily and made for the door at a full sprint, something the Syrian regretted a moment later when the ship rocked, knocking her off balance and sending her painfully to the floor. She fell badly this time, slamming her knee and shin against one of the protruding shelves of equipment. As she pulled herself up to her feet, the lights around her flickered, but steadied after a moment. The scientist hissed as she discovered she could no longer put much weight on her injured leg, but saw she did not have much distance to travel. Wincing, finding that something in her equipment was prodding painfully against her bruised waist, and leaning against the wall, she began to hobble her way forward until she noticed that Dr. Tarani had stopped crying. "Tarani, get over here and help me get to the door panel,"
Tarani's dead.
she said as she turned to look back at the other doctor. When she did look back, she found the door to the corridor was open, and where Dr. Tarani had been, only a smear of gore remained. Dr. Sheena snapped her eyes away quickly, hobbling closer to the door, wincing again as she felt something hard prod against her and the wall. Her data pad? Then she felt something else. In the wall. In the floor. It chilled her blood yet again, drove her fear into such a frenzy it was all she could do not to allow the darkness gnawing at the corners of her vision to devour her. The feeling was vibrations, footfalls. She remembered then, in a sudden fit of desperate energy, that she still had the blaster pistol on her, and without thinking, without planning, drew it from where it had been prodding her waist. She spun on her good leg, ignoring the surges of agony which her injured leg protested with, and fired. Her unexpected shot flew through the air, clean and level despite her lack of training and current condition. It scorched the air of the hallway, sped through the door leading out, and hissed against the wall. There was nothing there. Nothing behind her. The doctor held herself rigid, panting,
oh God,
sweating
this is like
as
a
she
Michael
watched
Myers
for
movie.
Movement, any movement. But as the 10th second slid by, there was still nothing. Just the creaking of the ship and the distant rumbles of weapons fire. Swallowing the lump which had formed in her throat, Dr. Sheena turned back toward the door, pistol still in hand, making her way to the panel. She felt something again, another rumbling in the wall, more vibrations behind her. She didn't turn this time, hobbling the last few steps to the control panel, feeling her skin crawl with each mechanical thump which rang through the wall she leaned on and the floor she stood on. Finally, the Syrian scientist fell against the panel and twisted painfully onto her back, gun out. Her pistol was trembling so hard in her hands that she doubted her aim would be able to hit any kind of mark this time, but that was beyond her concern, because there was no mark. The hallway, the prep room, the doorway, it was all still empty. She swallowed again and tasted bile there.
Shit.
Was she completely mad? Had she already lost her mind? Slowly, gingerly, she turned back towards the control panel, gripping its sides tightly as the ship creaked around her, almost as if in response to her own movements. She knew she didn't have her code cylinders on her, but the console before her was undamaged, so she resorted to her access code. Dr. Sheena began dialing it in, feeling the hairs rise on the back of her neck as she did. Something was wrong about all
Hey,
of
the
this.
Night Lords! Come on,
Where were
man!
they? What happened to the Jedi? Why was Dr. Tarani a red smear, and yet Sheena herself was still alive? And then, a cold, black thought struck through her, slid into her mind like an assassin's knife. Her fingers hovered above the last key, not having pressed it yet, a bead of sweat and blood dripping from the digit onto the control panel. She released the blaster pistol, her grip failing her, allowing it to fall to the ground with a clatter. Hands numb, she drew out her datapad instead, and with trembling fingers, she opened up the translation matrix which she had downloaded earlier. Ready for input. The datapad chimed. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as much as possible, given that she was almost certain that, despite present appearances, she was already as good as dead. She tried to speak but coughed and had to start again. What are you? What do you want? She asked into the air. The datapad chimed again, and then, using her own voice, it repeated the sentence in the outsider language. She listened, holding her breath, her ears working like they had never worked before. And it, whatever it was, answered. Its voice was deep, mechanical, but not born of a machine. There was too much emotion there, too much power, for this to be a droid. Translating. When it spoke a moment later, it did so as it had with her, and used the outsider's own voice to speak the translation.
I am an angel of death, and I have come to render judgment.
Oh, God,
At the
no.
enunciation of its last word, the ship's power finally failed.
Why? Just stop it. Just stop it. They're not the Night Lords. They're not the Night Lords. Come on, man.
Everything becoming black for a few heart-rending seconds before the emergency lighting kicked in. Red stripes of hazy light overlaid everything, dyeing the room in a crimson sheen outlined in long black shadows. Slowly, deliberately, she turned around. She needed to see it, and when she did, her breath was pulled from her body. Her eyes grew wide, but not wide enough to encompass the monstrous form of the Angel of Death. It stood over 2 meters tall and was as broad as a fully grown Herglik. It almost resembled an archaic depiction of a Knight of Zel or other such ancient warriors who donned armor and swords to set upon their enemies. But the comparison didn't do the thing justice. It was more like those ancient men had somehow looked upon this thing and had tried in vain to imitate the wonder of it, the terror of it. The doctor found herself so overtaken by the innate power emanating from this thing that it took her several seconds to realize that it was wounded. One of its arms, its right arm, was missing below the elbow. Looking at the opposite side for comparison, she found that its other intact hand was holding something small and bloody, something which still dripped with ichor. She let her eyes wander back to the softly glowing lenses of its head. It was looking down directly at her, and the attention alone felt lethal, as if it could smash her flat with just its eyes. She wondered, briefly, why she was even still alive.
That's what I'm wondering.
And then she remembered. It had been watching her type in her code, memorizing her security password.
Nice.
She looked down at its boot, the blue armor there more than just lit in red, but covered in it. Swallowing, she turned back around, looking down at the console. It hadn't shut off, still glowing a soft blue in the hazy light. It was still waiting for her last key. Dr. Sheena breathed in, feeling her mind frenzy behind her eyes, feeling her subconscious turning inside out in an attempt to save her. She breathed out and pressed the key. The console screen turned green and the airlock opened. At the same moment, a bright yellow beam of light sprang forth, humming in the air less than an inch from Sheena's own face. It was holding Renfi's lightsaber in its dripping fist. She knew what came next. The blade pulled away as the being, the angel, reeled back its arm. Sheena felt her lips twitch as she turned around one last time. Her heart was hammering, but her mind was oddly calm. It held the sword of light out like a proper executioner. It would end her cleanly and at once. She watched it, and it watched her, hands at her sides, chin tilted up, eyes open. It gave Sheena the slightest hint of a nod, and swung. She didn't have time to close her eyes, even to blink. So she watched as the yellow blade flashed through the air, watched as the ventilation shaft to her right suddenly burst open, a bright blue saber flying out from it, as Gaffin spun like a rotary blade through the air. He collided with and caught his master's yellow sword on his own beam of azure light. His face was fierce, full of fear and rage, full of conviction and purpose. Even as Dr. Sheena began to stumble back, Gaffin turned to her, eyes meeting hers for less than a second as his free hand thrust forward in her direction. At the gesture, a force, like a wind, but stronger, more shaped, more precise, more focused, picked her up and threw her into the room beyond. Inside, row after row of escape pods sat, awaiting
Run,
use,
squirrel!
and she landed almost inside of one, crying out as she fell against the bad side of her leg. She grabbed the handle near the door of the nearest pod and hauled herself up and over the lip, looking back to see Gaffin the Padawan doing his best to hold the monster in the hallway. He was much smaller than the Angel of Death, and was combining that with his agility to bolster his
World War III. They're hearing the sounds of combat, so they decided to... They're probably... What are they fighting over? What are they mad over?
They're just mad over being pugs.
They're just mad over being pugs? Okay.
advantage. But already she could see it wouldn't be enough. Watching as the inhuman thing Gaffin contended with weaved and moved, blocking his strikes and nearly landing several of its own. The pace of it was making Dr. Sheena disbelieve her own eyes. How could something so large and so heavily armored move like that? It defied all the laws and rules her mind had become so apt at mastering, and the sight of that armored thing rolling and spinning and ducking and striking with all the fluidity and grace of a waving flame plunged her into an inexplainable but all too powerful terror. With great effort, she tore her eyes away.
Okay, so that's actually a thing in 40K as well. It's called transhuman dread. Typically, humans don't deal that well when they get around Space Marines because the mind can't process what it's actually seeing. The mind has trouble actually coming to grips with something that is that large that can move like that. It's bizarre.
And crawled into the hatch, kicking the ceiling trigger with her good leg and watching the door slam shut. Sweating, tasting blood she knew wasn't her own, the doctor pulled herself up into a seat and punched the launch button. The seals which held the pod in the bay burst, and she was jettisoned from the metal meat grinder that the honor hound had become. Dr. Sheena huddled near the window, watching, but could not see the end of the fight. Still, she hoped to see another escape pod leaving after hers. She hoped to get some sign that she had been wrong, that she was not the only surviving member of the crew, the only person to escape that slaughter. What she saw instead was the wreckage of the fleet which surrounded her. No other escape pods detached from the smoldering, limping remains of the honor hound, and all around her, massive, godlike ships were firing weapons larger than star destroyers, mopping up the scattered remnants of the fleet. Starfighters and smaller craft still darted about, fighting for their lives as they were hunted down by swarms of tens of thousands of what passed for strike craft among these new invaders. The doctor felt her pod jerk suddenly, recognizing the loss of momentum that came with being seized by a tractor beam. She pressed her forehead against the cool window, feeling her leg throb painfully, feeling her head ache, feeling the blood of the clones, the blood of perhaps even Dr. Hackneyan, drying onto her skin and clothes. There was nothing more she could do. No more places she could run to as her pod was pulled in. The ship which was pulling her in had not stopped its own movement, and that much was evident in how long it was taking to pull her in. Dr. Sheena bit her lip as she was drawn further and further from the battle. She wanted to hope that she was being rescued, but the logic of that didn't sit well within her. Why wasn't the enemy pursuing? Why would an escaping ship even bother with her? Soon, she found the ship she was being pulled into was mostly unpowered, red emergency lights bathing the small hangar. She felt the last dredges of her adrenaline course through her as shapes approached the pod from the darkness, but she stayed put. The armored hands that opened the pod were the hands of clones, and they quickly entered and ferried her out, carefully setting her down on a crate within the dark hangar area. She was stunned, relieved, and deeply confused. "What's going on?" she asked. A clone which sat beside her gave her a painful slap on the shoulder and a laugh. "We're getting out of here, that's what." "But why aren't you already gone?" she pressed. The clone removed his helmet and scratched his head, smiling with no small amount of chagrin. He offered her a back inhaler as the other clones went into her pod and began to dismantle the rudimentary hyperdrive. Bucket, which was what the clone called itself, explained that they had escaped the battle by shutting down almost everything and acting like a dead ship with burning engines.
There you go.
Apparently, the only reason this had worked was because the ship was extremely close to being exactly that, and their navicomputer had been badly damaged. "So you picked me up because you needed my hyperdrive computer?" The clone smirked. You're welcome.
Well, there
The
you
clones
go.
wasted no time in hooking it up and getting it working, but Dr. Sheena had collapsed flat on the crate and fallen unconscious long before they managed to jump to hyperspace. And the doctor slept and slept. She had no idea for how long, but what she did know was that when she awoke, she was lying within a medical bay, a recently created cast constraining her injured leg. She could tell she was on Rothana by the smell, ferrous and fresh, as well as by the model of droid which was tending to her. It had clearly just injected her with something to wake her up, and she could see why right away. The doctor was surrounded by 3 Jedi and a clone. The nurse droid that had been tending to her drifted out of the room, and one of the Jedi approached the right side of her bed. He kneeled down next to her, making it easy for her to watch him without moving her bandaged head. He had a kind but concerned face. She did not know him. I understand that you've had quite an experience, Dr. Sheena. We hate to follow that up with questions so soon after what happened, but we are finding ourselves facing a little bit of an emergency, and we could use your help. Dr. Sheena chuckled at his understatements, and then laughed more loudly. In her mind, the horrors she had seen still reached out at her, grasping at her. She laughed at them. She mocked them with her laughter, because she had lived. She had survived Hell's touch, and now all it could do was scream at her in her own voice from the confines of her memories. Impotent, unreal, a failure. She laughed and laughed, because victory had never tasted so bitter and yet so sweet. This seemed to greatly affect the clone and the youngest Jedi, but a raised hand from the one speaking to her was enough to calm them as her manic episode wore itself out. Tell me, Mr. I'm sorry. What was your name again? Dr. Sheena asked. Please, call me Obi-Wan, he said. Well, Obi-Wan. Do you know anything of the Pius Dia?
Pius Dia. Okay. All right. So, that... Now, again, to anybody that's a fan of Star Wars, never seen me before, anything like that, I don't really deal in exaggerating things, but if you took a Star Destroyer and threw what is a squad of Space Marines on it, a Astartes, the chances of that squad of Astartes being able to basically take the Star Destroyer are relatively high. Space Marines are 800 pounds of genetically engineered flesh, muscle, redundancy on top of redundancy, and they're clad in more armor. That the amount of armor that's on just your standard assault marine, about a Dodge Durango worth. In any case, oh god. Yeah, that was exactly what I expected. It was about as brutal as I expected. But if it had been Black Templars, it would have been worse. In any case, I will catch you guys on the next one. Episode 6 is kind of right around the corner.